Hello YouTube, how's it going? This is the crossover and I'm back with another video. Today's going to be another one of my 2022 draft scouting reports, and today's video is going to be about Milwaukee's forward Patrick Baldwin Jr. So without any further delay, let's get straight into the video. Moving on to some stats regarding Pat Baldwin, he is 19 years old, stands at about 6 feet 9 inches, weighs about 220 pounds, and has a 6 foot 11-inch wingspan. Pretty good measurements for the young forward. However, this year for the Milwaukee Panthers, he is averaging, not going to sugarcoat it, pretty mediocre. 13.4 points, 6.6 rebounds, and 1.8 assists per game. He has an effective field goal percentage of 44.8% this year, and he's grabbing 12.6% of the total rebounds for his team. Pretty solid rebound percentage, nothing great, but not necessarily bad either. Pretty solid. However, that effective field goal percentage is pretty concerning. We'll talk more about that later on in the video. However, he is shooting 74.1% from the free throw line this year and has a 48.5% 3-point attempt rate, which essentially means that basically half of his shot attempts are coming from behind the arc, which I thought was a pretty interesting and important advanced statistic to list. And I also included his FIBA U19 stats, where he participated with the United States this previous summer, where he did average 7.7 points, 5 rebounds, and he shot 47.7% from the field and 32.1% from behind the arc. And while necessarily the counting stats aren't better with FIBA, I think in general he played much better with FIBA, as you can tell by his much better efficiency numbers, which we'll talk about in just a. Moving on to the strengths of Pat Baldwin as a prospect, first up we have his size at the forward position. As I just listed his measurements, I'm not going to get into it again, but you guys can probably tell that he's going to be able to guard both threes and fours at the NBA level. I believe those are going to be his two primary positions. I expect him to play much more at the 4 spot than the 3 spot. Maybe more 50-50 early on in his career as he looks to round out his frame, but I think his long term position is going to be that 4 spot, and I believe that with proper NBA training, once he gets used to the league, the way the NBA is played, the speed of the game. Once he rounds out his frame, I believe that he is going to be able to guard some twos, some of the bigger twos at the NBA level. However, moving on to the offensive side of the floor, which I believe to be the better side of the floor for him, is that I expect him to be an effective floor spacer at the next level. And I do highlight that he may struggle from day one. He doesn't have any clear hitches in his shot outside of his when he shoots the ball, when he's coming down, his legs kick outward, and like his like pelvis area pushes inward, and it's kind of weird. And I do think it messes with his shot both when he's spotting up and when he's pulling up, when he does have the ball in his hands. And I feel like it's one of the bigger issues in his game that needs to be addressed before the draft. And it's just weird because it's his form itself is smooth, it's clean, it doesn't have any hitches, but that lower body and pelvis motion, it doesn't allow him to get as much elevation on his shot as you would like, which probably plays into his inefficiencies. But I believe aside from that, it's his shot is pretty good, and I think that that I wouldn't necessarily call it a hitch because I've always been under the impression that a hitch more so has to do with your hand placement on the ball, like your release, stuff like that. So I'm not sure if you consider that lower body and pelvis movement more of a hitch, but I think it's something that needs to be ironed out. But if he's in a role in the NBA where he's just going to be a floor spacer from day one, which I believe that has to be his role in order for him to progress as an NBA player. If you just give him the ball from day one at the NBA level and say go Pat, he's going to struggle mightily. There's like players that struggle, and there's going to be Pat Baldwin, because if he's shooting as inefficient and inconsistently against this level of college competition that Milwaukee plays against, I can only imagine what it's going to be when he's being guarded by players like Tobias Harris or OG Anunoby or Mikal Bridges. So he's going to have a rough time in the NBA, but when he has the ball in his hands. But if he's just relegated to being a floor spacer, I think he's going to have much more success from day one. And I don't think he's going to be like any special shooter. He's not going to be like Desmond Bain and wow anybody right out the gate. But I think that he's at least going to be a player that defenses are going to have to respect from out there from day one. And I could totally see a world where he still shoots like 31, 32% from day one, and is struggles with spacing the floor. However, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think he's going to be shooting around 34, 35, 36%, on catch and shoot opportunities from three from day one. And even if it's not, I expect, his growth as a floor spacer to develop and be one of his stronger assets, as his career progresses. However, another one of the big strengths of Pat Baldwin is his polish in terms of creating his own shot. He has a deep bag of moves that he likes to go to. Very similar scorer, such as like Jabari Smith, for example. They both like to use jab steps. They kind of keep things simple, like what I highlighted with Jabari Smith. Pat Baldwin is similar in that aspect where he doesn't like to play. He doesn't necessarily like to dribble the ball or like get too fancy with it. He likes to be. He's a pretty smooth scorer. He's a pretty smooth scorer. He has the framework of being a creator at the next level. But again, it's going to take a lot of development, just like pretty much every other facet in his game. But the foundation is there, right? Like my last video with Jalen Duran, I talked about how he has so many holes, but I didn't see the foundation for a lot of those holes to be fixed. But with Pat Baldwin, I do see there being the foundation with him being able to space the floor and him being a shot creator. And in a minute, we can just transition into him defensively as well. Being that long, as I highlight, being a long-term perimeter defender. He's not going to be a great defender from day one, but with his speed again at his size, I believe that he's shown enough flashes at Milwaukee that you can be like, okay, if we take Pat Baldwin and we develop him in this role, right, we highlight this for him as part of his development, I could see that being a long term strength of his, and the same applies to on the offensive side of the floor, and even though he does have that hitch, you can still see the potential in Pat Baldwin. As a shot creator, not the hitch, but the lower body, kicking out into the that I guess it is a hitch. But aside from that, you can see his potential as a shot creator at the next level, which is enticing. And he does display great touch around the rim, which is very good. You love to see that out of a forward that is creating his shot as much as Pat Baldwin is for Milwaukee, and he just has solid instincts overall. Like you can just watch Pat Baldwin and be like, he's a hooper. He's a hooper, especially on the offensive side of the floor, where you can see the moves that he gets to, his form on his shot when he goes up outside of the lower body movement. And the way he gets to the rim, you can just tell that this guy's a hooper. And with proper development, I can definitely see him being a player at the next level who can play on and off the ball, as well as being a solid defender. I don't know about anything great. I did highlight his potential as a perimeter defender, but again, that's just potential. He showed enough flashes at Milwaukee for me to be like, all right, if a team takes this part of his game and develops it, then I could see that being a part of his strength at the next level. And all of this, pretty much for the past 6 minutes or so, all I've been talking about is development and ifs, which is really, in my opinion, the biggest strength of Pat Baldwin is that due to him being in such an abysmal situation in Milwaukee, this team is not good. They're a bad D1 team. He's playing under his father, and his father essentially gives him the green light to do whatever he wants. And since the rest of the team just isn't nearly as talented as Pat, the ball is in his hands, and he's just pulling up shots. And I think while some might say that that is a negative, the situation that he's in my opinion, it can almost be seen as his biggest strength, since he's in such a bad situation that if he is drafted by a very good NBA organization, or even just a competent NBA organization where they develop him the right way, you're essentially just drafting a ball of clay that you can develop any way you want. You want him to develop as a defensive player, he has the framework to do that. If you want to develop him more so as a guy who's going to space the floor, you can do that as well. If you want to develop him as a guy who's going to create his own shot, you can do that as well. You want to develop all these parts of the game, all these parts of his game, you can do that as well. That's the strength of having a prospect, as moldable as a Pat Baldwin. And I think, given how poor of a situation he's in college, just shows the ceiling of a player like Pat Baldwin. So in my opinion, his moldability is his greatest strength, as he's shown that he has a building blocks as a creator, as a floor spacer, as potentially a perimeter defender, as a guy who could score around the basket. So if he ends up with a solid NBA organization, I could see them taking his weaknesses, which pretty much all of his weaknesses he already has the foundation for and developing upon them. Moving on to the concerns I have with Pat Baldwin as a prospect, first up, we have his tunnel vision problems on the offensive side of the floor. For lack of a better term, he can be a ball hog on the offensive side of the floor. As I mentioned before, with one of his strengths being that he's so moldable, since he is in such a terrible situation. I stated that even if the situation proves to being, an average, NBA offense, you can expect to see a lot of growth from him over the course of his career as he's used more properly. And I just don't think he's being used properly with his father. Again, with his father being the coach, his father wants to have the ball in his son's hands, and he believes that his son can create his shot on the level of players like Jabari Smith or even Paulo Banchero, and that's just Pat Baldwin is just not that kind of a player. I think he needs to be used much more off ball, and I think he played much better in with the FIBA team because he was playing more so off ball. Even though the counting stats don't suggest that, you can see that in terms of his efficiency. However, this year for Milwaukee, he just has the ball in his hands all the time, and he's developed to be a bit of a ball hog. He has tunnel vision, and he simply just doesn't see a shot that he doesn't like, and his shot selection is just extremely poor. And if he took more efficient shots, if he didn't take such contested shots, combined with how he doesn't get much elevation on his shot, as we talked about with that the weird motion with his legs and like his pelvis area, then I think his efficiency would be much better, and I expect him to be used much better at the NBA level. However, if he does end up with a poor development with an NBA team where they do have a poor development group of coaches and staff, and they just give him the ball and they enable his tunnel vision, it's going to be a problem, and I don't expect Pat Baldwin to be developed in the proper way if teams enable him to create his own shot from day one and play into his tunnel vision, which is an issue that is going to have to be fixed via NBA development more so than something he can do on his own. Moving on is he just doesn't have much elevation on his pull-ups as we talked about before with the hitch, and I think more so on the defensive side of the floor he ball watches a lot on the defensive side of the glass, which as I talked about before with him playing such poor competition, it's pretty you know alarming that he's not as aggressive on the defensive glass as he needs to be. And I get that not everybody can be a Jabari Smith, and I feel like in for most of the time with Patrick Baldwin, I was comparing him to Jabari Smith, because you look at Jabari Smith and you just look at the effort and the hustle that he plays with, how aggressive he is on the boards, and that mentality that he has of just being ultra aggressive on the court. And you don't see that a lot of time from Pat Baldwin. Now that could be just the culture of the team. Maybe that could just be the role that his father wants it. Maybe his father wants him more so leaking out than like grabbing the rebounds per se. It could be any number of things, but there's too many times on the defensive glass where Pat Baldwin could just go get the ball and he doesn't. And I think he's going to need all the strengths that he can get at the next level in order to earn minutes. And if he's not going to be aggressive at the glass as a 6'9", 220-pound forward, especially against lesser college competition, we're not even talking about him playing, the Alabamas. They played Florida and they got blown out, and he had a pretty average game. I decided to include his Florida game log. For video content on his concerns to show how he compares to better college competition where he's not necessarily where this is kind of like the average game for Pat Baldwin where he's kind of average, right? He doesn't necessarily stand out all that much. He shows flashes, but at the same time he shows his concerns. So that's why I decided to show the Florida video more so for his concerns rather than his strengths, to show what he looks like against even good college competition. Because Florida's a good team. They could be a really good team in certain instances, but they're not necessarily amongst the very good or really good or top tier college teams. So that just shows you how Pat Baldwin compares. And I feel like he needs to be more aggressive on the defensive glass, especially at the NBA level where he's going to be around the rim a lot. As I expect him to be able to guard threes and fours. So you would love to see him be more aggressive than he is on the defensive glass currently. And also, I believe his defensive IQ is just kind of lacking. He loses his man a lot, like a lot of times. And again, as I talked about with the level of competition, not necessarily the best, the craziest of schemes that he's playing against. It's just very concerning. It's very concerning when he loses his man in basic situations. And it's also worth noting, as I highlight, that Milwaukee plays a lot of zones, which makes these lapses even more concerning. You're playing zone. You only have a certain amount of area on the court that you have to cover. And when he can't even do that at an efficient rate, it gets concerning. It gets really concerning, and he just loses sight of his man a lot, even though he does have potential as an on-ball long-term potential as an on-ball defender at the NBA level. Just he's just kind of a mess right now as a help defender. And I think again that I don't even know if defenses can necessarily help him with that, just because it's just something that some players have. Maybe it's effort. I don't know. Maybe his father's telling him don't necessarily worry to just worry about scoring. Maybe his mindset is all just scoring. Maybe he's just approaching defense, as just like whatever other guys can defend and I can shoot. Maybe I'm just speculating at this point. Maybe his father's just emphasizing him to just go out and score, which obviously he's doing based on the shots that Pat is taking. So maybe that's the case, but it's just very concerning when a guy can when a top 10 prospect in the eyes of many people can't can't be an effective or even a net neutral help defender, at the college level against poor D1 competition, for a lack of a better term, guys that have no chance of being NBA players. So it's very concerning is his IQ and his off ball defense. It's very alarming in my opinion. And my biggest thing with Pat Baldwin, aside from all these, which are very big concerns, is that he's just not dominating. And there's games that I watch, and Milwaukee games. As much as I love basketball, and I'll watch just about any basketball content I can get my hands on. Watching players like Jabari Smith, Chet Holmgren, you know, even Jalen Duren. Jalen Duren disappears on from play to play, but I mean he's a center and he's a back. He's a lob finisher, right? He's not going to touch the ball all that much, right? But for Pat Baldwin to disappear from games as much as he does with the ball in his hands, it's just concerning. And it's even more concerning given the competition, right? I keep going back to the competition. As I highlight here, the best game that he's had all year was a 26-point game where he went 6 of 6 from three to playing against a 2-12 Robert Morris team. And you might say, well, he had 26 points. Like, what are you talking about? Like, how is that? How is that a line? Because the only good games that he has, this is the best. He went 6 for 6 from three. That's not sustainable over the course of a period of time. I would much rather see Pat Baldwin shoot 3 for 7, 4 for 8, 5 for 9, 3 for 9 over the course of multiple games than go 1 for 12, 2 for 10, shoot very poor percentages, and then have one game where he goes and then have 6 for 6 or 5 for 6, 6%, something like that, right? You would like to see much more consistency from Pat Baldwin, and the fact that he doesn't, playing against such poor competition, is very alarming. And in my opinion, he's a very raw prospect, as we've covered, even though he has, as I stated before, frameworks and the framework of being an on-ball creator, a floor spacer with proper development, right? Being a perimeter defender, he does just have certain alarming weaknesses, such as his off-ball defensive IQ, his defensive IQ in general. The lower body. I'm gonna just say a lower body hitch. There we go, a lower body hitch in his jump shot that prevents him from getting elevation on his shot. His tunnel vision. They're all very, very alarming things. This is a situation that he's in. We don't even know his mindset in terms of play. I mean, he's been being coached by his father pretty much all his life. How's that going to translate at the next level? His lack of aggression on the defensive glass, even though he is moldable. There are some alarming weaknesses with Pat Baldwin that I think are going to have to be ironed out by NBA teams. And again, Pat Baldwin is a ball of clay, so he needs to end up in a situation where the game is simplified for him from day one. And I'm very concerned if he ends up in a situation like Sacramento or Milwaukee or even Oklahoma City, where he's in a losing culture, and they're gonna give him the ball. He has to have a defined role. He needs to be around. He has to be in a winning organization, in my opinion. And I just don't. With him being a top 10 pick, when you look at the top 10 picks this year, it's just how many organizations you know can benefit him in the way that he needs to be benefited, right? So I'm not sure about him being a top 10 pick. I think he needs to fall a little bit lower and then be in an organization where his role is simplified and his development is taken very seriously as much more of a long-term process than a short-term process. And don't get me wrong, Pat Baldwin, if Pat Baldwin's ceiling is a guy who can create his own shot on the ball, space the floor effectively off ball, can get to the basket, and be a solid perimeter defender at 6'9", 220 pounds at 19 years old, where he can grow to maybe 6'10", 6'11", and maybe add, 10, 15 pounds, on his frame. But, looking at what we have now, it's a long way up from there, and he's going to have to improve in literally every facet of the game. And again, I think he needs to end up with the organization, with the developmental staff that is going to limit what he can do on the court from day one. Give him a defined role. Be like your shoot spot ups and you hustle your ass off on defense. That needs to be Pat Baldwin's role for at least the first year in his career. And he's much more of a long term project than a short term project. And him being a top 10 pick, I just don't it doesn't I don't think personally that it's gonna do him much wonders. And unless he ends up in a situation like with a very good organization that has that plan for him instead of throwing him into the fire from day one. That's not going to do him any favors. So could he work in an organization, excuse me, like Oklahoma City or Sacramento? Maybe, yeah, possibly. But I'd much rather prefer him being in a winning culture, away from all this losing that he's been doing in Milwaukee, playing under his father. I think he needs to be in a very professional uh, organization. And, I don't think being drafted in the top 10 will do him much favors unless a team is willing to take that route with him. And, it's a hard sell. It's a hard sell because the guy has so much to work on. And it's like you're taking a guy in top 10. You want to see an impact from day one, but you're just not going to see that from Pat Baldwin. So in my opinion, I think he should fall a little bit lower than top 10. I expect him to be, maybe I'd say maybe a 15 to 20 first round pick, and is much more of a long term project. Compared to watching again, Pat Baldwin is a very raw prospect on both sides of the floor that I think has long term potential as an on ball creator and as a floor spacer. I think he'll be a serviceable floor spacer from day one, and as well as he has long term potential as a perimeter defender. However, I think my opinion, I think he should end up with an NBA franchise that is going to take his developmental much more as a long-term project rather than a short-term project. And I think he should end up in a stable NBA situation where the team has a defined culture and just an organization filled with professionals, as he was playing in kind of a poor environment, playing under his father and against such mediocre competition and with such mediocre talent around him. Again, I think that type of an NBA team would be the ideal landing spot for him. I know I just stated that I think he should be a 15 to maybe 20 pick. But I think the Spurs are the best fit for him. I think he fits a need for them at that forward spot, and I think they could bank on his long term upside with that. Given that he does have star upside, his best case scenario, as we talked about before, and I think he's kind of the ideal organization that I think he would end up in. And they currently have the ninth pick, but I think as the season goes on and the later parts of the season, I think some of the young guys will kind of step up for them. And I doubt that they finish with the ninth pick. I expect them to finish with the 12th, 13th pick. So anywhere from like that 10 to like 20 range, I think that's a pretty fair range for Pat Baldwin. But you guys let me know what you guys think about him. Do you guys think he should be, a lottery pick, right outside the lottery, and the later half of the lottery, first half of the lottery? You guys let me know what you guys think about it in the comments below. And, that's the end of the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching.